As Liverpool once again gear up to face Manchester United, it's telling that as well as looking forward to another massive match of huge importance to these famous old football clubs, we also know that one thing seems to be guaranteed in this fixture. It's not goals or any other on-pitch activity, but it's tragedy chanting. Not a modern day phenomenon by any means, but something that doesn't seem to be going away, and indeed it's actually growing in prevalence every season. Tragedy chanting is when fans sing songs that reference disasters or fatal incidents involving rival players or supporters. It happens throughout the season in different leagues, but often focusing on the same clubs. It gets widely condemned by bodies and individuals, both within and outside of the sport, and has been part of the uglier side of football culture for decades. Examples of the targets of such chants include Manchester United for the Munich air disaster of 1958 when 23 people died, including 11 Manchester United players and staff. Leeds United, who had 2 supporters murdered in Istanbul before a Champions League semi-final with Galatasaray in 2000. Bradford City for the 56 people that died in the fire at their stadium, Valley Parade, in 1985. Rangers for the 66 people that died in the second and most recent disaster at Ibrox in 1971. And Liverpool for the 97 people that died because of Hillsborough in 1989. Along with constant crude references to the 39 people that died in the Heysel Stadium disaster that was instigated by Liverpool fans charging into a section populated by Juventus fans in the 1985 European Cup final. There are, of course, other instances of vile and offensive chanting, but much of what we know as tragedy chanting in the UK revolves around these examples. Now, as a Liverpool supporter, I'll naturally gravitate to the chanting that affects us, namely Hillsborough and Heysel. But it's important to admit collective culpability here, and how pre-Hillsborough, Munich taunts were routinely aimed at Manchester United, and it wasn't just chants in the stadium. I remember seeing Munich 58 graffiti on the walls of my primary school playground, as well as everywhere else around the city. I had no idea what it meant. I was 5 or 6, but I do remember feeling uncomfortable with it and not understanding why. I would see more graffiti at my secondary school, and by this time I'd already started going to Anfield, where Munich songs were routinely sung and Munich 58 was crudely painted onto banners. By this time I understood the context, but even at a young age I hated it, because there was hatred attached to it. As much as even as a 10-year-old child, I despised Manchester United like I do now as a 48-year-old adult. I couldn't bring myself to genuinely hate another set of people. For this, I'm thankful because I would have had no idea of the effect that such cruelty could inflict on others. The temptation is to say that it was a different time, that behaviour of society at large, and certainly inside football stadiums, has changed for the better. But the reality is that football supporters knew then, as they do now, how to push the buttons of opposition supporters. After Hillsborough, Munich chants and banners all but disappeared from the Kop, as if a giant mirror had been held up. People could see that we had no right to exploit a tragedy. And I remember Manchester United's visits to Anfield in the early 90s being punctuated with the chant, "Where's your Munich song?" The Kop are usually the best in the business when it comes to immediate and cutting comebacks, but there was no response to this. How could there be? In the decades after, Munich and Hillsborough references between the two clubs slowed to a trickle, even if they were always there, perpetuated by the kind of morons that will always be part of a larger supporter group. However, over recent years, references to Hillsborough, Heysel and also poverty-based chants have massively increased at stadiums around the country whenever Liverpool play, and certainly not just against United. There are very few supporter groups around the country who haven't taken part in this, using the trope of Liverpool supporters as victims. Many fans do not acknowledge this as a Hillsborough reference, with many people performing mental and moral gymnastics to put plausible deniability in between their own words and the destructive effect that they can have. If you're singing "Always the victims, it's never your fault," but somehow claiming this as no reference at all to the most egregious case of any set of football supporters being victims and telling the world that it wasn't their fault, yet being met with a conspiracy to deny them justice, then I'm afraid that stretches any kind of credibility to breaking point. Some chants go even further and are even more direct. Whereas voices celebrating death have been in an albeit very vocal minority in recent seasons, when Manchester United beat Liverpool at Old Trafford in the FA Cup this season, tens of thousands of home supporters could be heard singing various deplorable chants, leading to the arrest of 2 fans for causing intentional harassment, alarm and distress through chanting. For balance, there was an image circulating on social media after the match of a Liverpool supporter making Munich gestures. And for absolute clarity here, I am condemning all kinds of tragedy-related abuse. Whataboutery has got no place in this discussion. As football fans, we must recognise that we've got more in common with each other than we have differences. And using death and misery as part of football banter and one-upmanship is crass, disgusting, and ultimately devoid of the wit, creativity and humour that can sometimes show the best parts of supporting a football team. So what can be done about this, or are we doomed to exist in a landscape where cowards feel the cloak of invisibility when surrounded by thousands of people locked in groupthink, or even worse, sitting from their relative safety or behind their phone? The FA introduced a new charter this season dealing with matters on the pitch, but it also addresses the issue of tragedy chanting. Now, for the most part, these are just words from the FA that might not fill those expecting action with confidence. However, and more interestingly, is the updated guidance from the Crown Prosecution Service brought in at the start of the season, confirming that tragedy-related abuse is a public order offence and therefore prosecutable. And while this season has undoubtedly seen a rise in tragedy chanting, there have also been a number of high-profile arrests and prosecutions. For instance, 2 Millwall supporters, a father and son, were convicted for making vile, tragedy-related gestures to Leicester City fans. 2 Stoke City fans were convicted for chants at Leeds Ellen Road, and 3 Arsenal fans were convicted for anti-Liverpool tragedy chanting in January. For the most part, the convictions have led to football banning orders and fines, but last year, a Sheffield Wednesday fan received a suspended sentence for using a photo of Bradley Lowry to mock Sunderland supporters. Bradley Lowry was a young Sunderland fan who died of cancer at the age of 6. The use of law must continue, but the clubs themselves and the media at large must be more proactive in calling out this behaviour, but then using actions as well as words to affect the situation. Last season, we saw Erik ten Hag and Jurgen Klopp come together to urge fans to move past this. But it's the engagement of the fans themselves that will ultimately determine any meaningful change. But change is possible. Liverpool fans would often have a stadium full of people chanting a homophobic slur whenever Chelsea played at Anfield. Fan groups tried to change this, and when Jurgen Klopp produced a video explaining this with Liverpool LGBTQ+ group cop-outs, it had a visible and audible effect. Although there have been arrests for people chanting it earlier this season, it's not a chant you'll hear en masse, proving that fans policing themselves is the greatest way to affect change. It's what we've seen with racist abuse over the years, and hopefully it'll be what we see next with vile tragedy, poverty and human misery-centred chanting. But to get to this stage of self-policing, clubs need to lead the way in not just condemning these chants, but being proactive in identifying and banning these individuals. The technology is there, but the will must be there too.